The history of Vasto begins with a legend that it was founded by a Diomedes, who, after the defeat of the Trojans, left with his people and settled along the coast of southern Italy and the islands close to the coast, which used to bear his name. From there they also founded a settlement on the mainland which they called Histonium in the 12th century before Christ. A people called the Frentani, referred to as Italics and believed to be of Semitic origins, settled in the hilly areas, as there the natural environment was suitable for grazing sheep and afforded them safety from attacks. Following the defeat of the Frentani by the Romans in 305 BC and the Social War in 98 BC, Histonium was elevated to a Roman municipality, and hence the title around its modern emblem, in Latin, Vastum Olim Histonium Romanum Municipium. During the Roman period, Histonium had a Capitol hill, thermal baths, an amphitheatre, now buried under Piazza Rossetti, temples, and many villas built during the Augustan period. Many of the remains of the latter were destroyed by the 1956 earthquake. The Romans also left a legacy in the new growth area to the north of the town, as can be seen in the regular street pattern, which they used in the urban planning. From the 3rd century AD, there began a long decline of Histonium, due to the decadent Roman Empire itself. There was also a disastrous earthquake in 346. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Longobards, under Theodoric, sacked Histonium and added it to the Dukedom of Benevento. In 802, it was destroyed again, this time by the Franks led by Pepin the Short, and his captain Vasto Daimone, Duke of Dordogne. The latter was given part of the land and, taking by its beauty, decided to rebuild it and called it after his own name. From the 9th to the 14th century, Histonium went through a turbulent period of wars and passed through a series of feudal lords. The fearsome Saracens devastated the town a number of times, and also there were the Hungars as well. Between 1041 and 1271, it became part of the possessions of the Abbacy of San Giovanni in Venere, which is due to the north of Vasto. The town was also sacked by the Crusaders in 1194 and the Venetians in 1240. In the year 1177, Pope Alexander III was forced to spend a month in Histonium due to a storm at sea. In recognition for its hospitality, in the same year, the then Pope Pius VI granted it the right to celebrate a jubilee, which is still celebrated each year. Vasto dei Mone, which was consolidated with the nearby Guasto Gisone, came under the changing control of successive families. The Caldora, who built the still existing Caldoresco Castle, and the towers of Bassano, Diomede de Moro, and that of Santo Spirito, then the Guevara, and the Davalos. Finally, in 1496, it was given in fief to Rodrigo Davalos, who kept it until 1798. The Davalos, who came from a Spanish noble family, brought with them the splendor of the Spanish court and built a splendid palace. The palace and the city was sacked and burnt by a Turkish invasion in 1566, which left 200 dead and 120 were taken as slaves. The palace, however, was rebuilt in the Renaissance style. The town, after it was rebuilt, due to its beauty, was referred to as the Athens of the Abruzzi. On the 29th of March 1710, Charles III of Austria gave Vasto the privileges of the title of city. The French Revolution had a substantial impact on Vasto. The leaders, the local Jacobins, were essentially from the more active members of the middle class, people who saw the possibility of personal gain and upward social mobility. Before, they unscrupulously used to exploit the poorer classes, but later would talk of equality and liberty. It was the only time in the history of Vasto that the people of the lower classes, labourers and peasants, actually revolted. They shot a couple of municipal leaders and killed 2 Jacobins, then sacked and looted the homes of wealthy people. The revolution meant little change in practice for the people of Vasto. With the suppression of the churches, many of the properties were sold cheaply, and these went to the established wealthy families. In 1808, Joseph Napoleon took advantage of the fighting between the factions of the Santa Maria and San Pietro parishes and decided to build the church of San Giuseppe as the sole parish for the citizens of Vasto. During this period, there was a series of epidemics of typhoid and cholera, as well as a landslide in 1817. When Garibaldi was making his way up the peninsula, Vasto was the first town to declare itself free of the Bourbon government in Naples in 1860, and raised the tricolour flag of Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel. Even with this change, the masses were hardly involved, and in fact showed loyalty to the former government. They only became aware of the existence of the Italian state when it imposed heavy taxations and military service for the young. In the second half of the 19th century, there was a strong growth in population and new housing outside the historical centre. The railway line was built in this period, which was an important link to the rest of Italy for Vasto. Abruzzo, as for the rest of southern Italy, was not developed economically by the new Italian state. In fact, resources were redirected to the development of industrial areas in the north. Protests by the people of their hardships were treated as brigand uprisings or illegal protests and were severely repressed. Agricultural developments in the Puglie took away pastoral areas from the Abruzzi shepherds, one of the mainstays of the economy. The protective wheat policy introduced by the government made food expensive for the people. From 1870 onwards until World War I, there was an increasing wave of migration from Vasto and the rest of Abruzzo. In 1913, which was the largest annual figure, 872,000 emigrated from Italy as a whole. The largest number went to the Americas, the reason being that the port of Naples was accessible by railway line and the shipping cost was relatively lower. Also, the abolition of slavery in South America meant that cheap labor was needed for agriculture there. The remittance of funds by immigrants have always played an important role in the Italian economy in helping with the national balance of payments. It also resulted in the expansion of Vasto with new buildings to the north and west. In 1906, Vasto also saw electric lights installed in the town for the first time. After World War I, there was a tense situation in the whole of Italy due to the unresolved pre-war conditions and the heavy burden of the cost of the war. The earlier liberal governments were in crisis, and the rising socialists were seen to pose a threat. This allowed the Fascist Party to come to power. Once in power, the Fascist Party wiped out all opposition by force throughout Italy. In fact, in the local elections in Vasto in 1924, there was only one non-fascist member in the city council, Florindo Ritucci, who soon retired from politics. In the fascist period, however, there were significant public works carried out in Vasto. The water pipeline from the Sinello, drainage of the marshes of Vignola, schools, monument to Rossetti, and other public works. In 1938, during the fascist regime, Vasto was renamed Estonio, in the vogue of things Roman, and also a clear reference to the old Roman name of Estonia, which lasted until the autumn of 1944. The climax of the regime came with the proclamation of the empire and the war against Spain. Many young men left as volunteers for these destinations in the hope of finding a better future.
Città nera, bella vistina, aspetta e spera che già l'ora si intravede l'altro re. A Città nera, bella vistina.
La splendida vittoria di Barcellona è un altro capitolo nella storia della nuova Europa che noi stiamo creando.
During the war period and the passing through of the Allied troops, relatively little damage occurred in Vasto. A few buildings were mined by the Germans and there were some minor skirmishes. Without much regret for the past, a new page of history was turned with the need for Italy and Vasto to reconstruct, especially in its civil life and social structures. The USA had closed its gate to migration in the post-World War I period, and the fascist regime made it even more difficult to migrate there. Most went to South America in the interwar period. Italy and Vasto faced a disastrous economic situation and bitter political struggle between major political parties following post-World War II. There were conflicts, wild strikes, and illegal activities. With the economic difficulties and the resultant poverty in the period post-World War II, migration resumed. In the 1950s and 60s saw perhaps the biggest wave of immigration from Vasto and Abruzzo, but this time to Australia and Canada, who had opened their doors. The Vastesi migrated to two main centres, Perth in Western Australia and Toronto in Canada, where there are considerable concentrations. To add to its woes, in 1956 there was another major landslide which destroyed a substantial section of the old town. The church of San Pietro was badly damaged and it was decided to demolish it, keeping only its facade. Beginning in the 60s, Italy and Vasto began the so-called economic miracle, which led to a substantial recovery and a decrease in migration by the early 70s. Vasto was at last recognized as a place of potential tourism by the national government, and many new hotels were built at Vasto Marina. A number of industries were built near Vasto, such as the glassworks, sieve, Magneti Marelli, and other minor industries. These provided labour for many workers. The economy is now more varied and based on industry, agriculture, and tourism. Cultural events of national significance were begun, and the city expanded considerably. Substantial public works were undertaken, such as sewage and electricity, a new hospital, completion of the port of Punta Penna, and so on. These have now made Vasto into a small modern city with all its accompanying problems.